Uczelnia ASBIRO, stworzona przez przedsiębiorców dla przedsiębiorców.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be invited here to speak. I was last in Warsaw in 2002. This is my second time in Warsaw. I haven't been here for 18 years. And I've noticed a few changes, I have to say. The cars are different. In 2002, there were more sort of larders and things like that. So you're doing better in cars. When I was on the bus in Warsaw in 2002 speaking English to my host, Justina, people found this so amazing that they wanted to come up to me and practice English and practice the swear words they'd learned and things. But now speaking English is 10 a penny and everyone seems to speak English here. And one of the things that we discussed in 2002, myself and my friend from Poland who I met when I was at university and she was an exchange student, wasn't it amazing? She was born in 1979 and I was born in 1980. And we were brought up during the Cold War. And we said, wasn't it amazing to think that 10 or 20 years ago, certainly, this meeting wouldn't be possible. We couldn't possibly be friends because it was next to impossible for a British person to go to Poland. It was a very rare thing to happen, and it was certainly extremely rare for a Polish person to be able to come to England. There was a Cold War. There was this system that you lived under, communism. And some people may argue that there are benefits to it, but one of the downsides to it definitely was the attitude towards truth, that there were clear dogmas and statements that this is the way history is, this is the cause of history, this is why life happened. And these were not allowed to be questioned. One of the ideas that you had was so-called Lysenkoism. This is this idea that intelligence and things like this and heredity is heavily influenced, everything is heavily influenced by the environment. And this was a dogma which wasn't permitted to be questioned. There was an attitude towards truth that you can't speak. There's truth. And there's moral truth. And the truth is what the party tells you is the truth. Rather like in 1984. If the party tells you black is white, then black is white. And we thought it was amazing. And we were talking about this, myself and Justina. And she was saying, yeah, under communism, there were more things that you couldn't say. To do this was forbidden. To say this was forbidden. This country was not free. And England was free. In England in 1980, you could say what you liked. You could discuss the truth. You could take the scientific evidence and take it to its conclusion without fear of any problems. But now you see, that situation has reversed. And it's been so wonderful over the last 24 hours to be in a free country. It's an amazing feeling to be in a country where I feel safe to talk about the scientific research that I do without people potentially shouting abuse at me, saying this research is immoral, saying the research is racist, saying the research is anti-egalitarian or whatever. There are colleagues of mine who have been fired from their universities in Britain for looking into these areas of research that I'm about to talk to you about now. There was a colleague of mine called Noah Carl who was working at Cambridge University, and last year he was fired from Cambridge University for having looked into these areas of research. Now, do you get many people in Poland who are fired, who are scientists, who publish scientific papers at a certain point that people don't like, and as such they lose their jobs? Do you? Oh, good God. But in England, it's a very serious problem, and very recently a lot of people have had to experience this sort of thing. If the research is not consistent with certain dogmas, certain moral truths, that everybody is equal and everybody is the same, then you can be in very serious trouble. And this is the research I want to look at today. And specifically the area of, can I hold this further away? Is that all right? No, I can't. It has to be here. Is it right? Okay. Which is this issue of intelligence and the idea that we are declining in our intelligence. We are becoming less intelligent. And this is very important to know, of course, because if you want to make policies, if you want to make any kind of plans that are successful, then you have to know what's going on. You have to understand the truth, the reality. If plans are based on dogmas that do not relate to reality, then you will be in trouble. So what I want to do is look at what intelligence is, how we were selecting for intelligence until about 1800, how we are now selecting for low intelligence, and what the results may well be. So, what is this thing, intelligence? Intelligence is the ability to solve cognitive problems and to solve them quickly. So do I really have to have it this close to my mouth? Because it's really quite... Can I be here? Can you hear me? Okay, fine. So this is much better. Okay, so what is this thing, intelligence? Intelligence is essentially the ability to solve cognitive problems and to solve them quickly. Intelligence is around 0.8 heritable. That means in terms of genetics, 0.1 heritable is weak, 0.1 heritable is absolutely heritable, 0.8 heritable is very highly heritable. So there's a degree to which how intelligent you are will be strongly inherited from your parents. People will tend to have the same kind of IQ as their parents. You will get outliers who may, due to complex and unlikely combinations of genes, have a very different IQ from their parents, but in general, IQ is about 0.8 heritable. There are different kinds of intelligence. The main three, you can conceive of intelligence as a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid are abilities which are very weakly related to what we call general intelligence. Things like the ability to drive a car, things like the ability to do up your laces, things like the ability to social skill, for example, how socially skilled you are, correlates with intelligence at about 0.3. As you move up the pyramid, you get the main three forms of intelligence that you'll know about from IQ tests, that is to say, verbal intelligence, mathematical intelligence, and spatial intelligence. And then above that, you have this thing, general intelligence, which underpins all of them. They're all reducible down to it, and this is about 0.8 heritable. Now, intelligence is distributed on a bell curve, rather like this, you see. It's rather like height. The vast majority of people, in terms of bunch around the height average, and then smaller and smaller percentages of people are much, much taller than the average or much, much smaller than the average. This is what you get with intelligence. So here you have the average people that have an IQ of 100 or around 100. IQ of 100 would be a job like being a policeman, being a fireman, the typical average job, sitting in front of a computer all day and putting in data you don't understand. This would be the average intelligence, right? Then above that, one standard deviation above that, you have an IQ of 115, 15 points above. That would be the IQ normally of a school teacher, an accountant, maybe, something like that. And then down here you have 15 points below the average, 85. This would be the IQ of, let's say, somebody who works in a factory or a security guard or something like that. Then you get down here the IQ of 85 down to 70. So this is going to be people who are on the borders of, who are just about working, casual laborers, things like that, and people who are unemployed, long-term unemployed, criminals, that kind of thing. Then you have very low IQ, below 70. This is outside the normal category. This is people who would be what we would call, in psychology, retarded. Then up here, you have the IQ, as I said, between 115 and 130. That's above average IQ. 130 IQ, 120 is the average IQ of a lawyer or a doctor, something like that. 130, average IQ of, let's say, a university professor of science, okay? And then up here, above 130, you have the very clever people. That is to say, people like us. Now, if you... Intelligence correlates with all kinds of important things. It correlates with education. It correlates with socioeconomic status. It correlates with salary, health, law-abidingness, migration, occupational status, social skill, being trusting of people, talking speed, how aging slowly, having liberal political opinions, being irreligious, legitimacy, i.e. not having illegitimate children or yourself being an illegitimate child, open-mindedness, and much, much more. So those people that say intelligence is not important are talking nonsense. Intelligence is evidently important because it correlates with all kinds of socially valued traits. At the national level, intelligence predicts pretty much every aspect of civilization you can think of. Education level, how law-abiding the society is, how much the crime rate of the society is, the life expectancy of the society, the health of the society, all kinds of things are all correlated quite strongly, actually, at about 0.6 with the IQ, the average IQ of the society. Now, people will say, well, the problem with IQ tests and when you measure IQ is that it measures being good at IQ tests. It measures that. But does it really measure intelligence? Can you really say that it measures cognitive ability? Isn't it Aren't there all kinds of problems saying it measures cognitive ability, isn't it? Stress and all kinds of things. Well, the way we can get round that is that the indicator of a good instrument is that it correlates with other instruments that measure the same thing. So you can say that an IQ test is subjective. You can say, of course, if you've got some lovely middle-class family, you're going to be exposed to lots of words and your linguistic intelligence will go up. Fine. But it correlates IQ with objective measures, with measures that don't have the cultural element to them, such as reaction times negatively. So that is to say, how if you have a bank of lights in front of you and a light goes on, you press a button quickly. When the light goes on, how quickly you press that button correlates with IQ at about 0.3. And so it correlates with reaction times. It correlates with brain size. So the bigger your brain is, the bigger your cranial capacity. That correlates at about 0.3 with intelligence. So people that are intelligent seem to have bigger heads. And it correlates with height weakly, particularly in men. It correlates about 1 with height. Cleverer people are taller. Why? Because women sexually select in men, or in prehistory they did for 2 things. They sexually select for high-status men. High-status men are good at winning fights, so they're tall, and high-status men are good at negotiating and inventing things and gaining social status, so they're intelligent. So the 2 things become typically related, and intelligent men tend to be taller slightly on average. It also correlates even with facial symmetry, i.e. how good-looking you are. How good-looking you are, people who are better-looking, people who are basically more sexually attractive are, on average, more intelligent. And this is a genetic issue. It's because the brain is 84% of the genome, which means that it's incredibly sensitive to mutation. If you have mutations in the body, you will sure as damn it have them in the brain, which will slow down the functioning of your brain and make you less intelligent. And so if you have a symmetrical face, then that means you don't have many mutant genes in the face, which make your face asymmetrical and ugly. It also means that you have a good immune system, which means you can fight off pathogens, which means you can maintain a symmetrical phenotype in the face of disease. So you have a symmetrical face, low mutation in the mind. Good-looking people are cleverer than ugly people. And looking out here today, it's quite obvious to me I'm in a very intelligent room. Now, so you can see then it's an objective thing. Therefore, intelligence is extremely important if you want to maintain civilization. Even if you want to maintain a company that works well, intelligence it correlates even with planning and future orientation. It correlates with almost everything that can be regarded as socially positive. Now, in pre-industrial societies, we were subject to selection for intelligence. We were under harsh Darwinian selection. And the people who were rich, the richer 50% of the population, of the English population, based on wills in the 17th century, in the 1600s, the richer 50% of people that left wills had about 40% more surviving children than the poorer 50% of people that left wills. So we were selecting for wealth. Now, why was that the case? Why were we selecting for wealth? Well, because if you're rich, then you can give your children better conditions, you can give them better food, you can give them, they're less likely to get ill, and so on. And so obviously they're more likely to survive. So there was what we call the survival of the richest. If you take away the wills and you just look at parish records, then the relationship between fertility and wealth was 100%, so that the richer 50% of the population had 100%, double the number of children as the poorer 50%. We have data on this in I think in one Polish city as well, certainly from Germany and from all kinds of other countries. This was the case. This is what was going on. We were selecting for intelligence. Now, intelligence predicts how much money you have at about 0.4, which is quite a reasonable correlation. So we were selecting for intelligence, and therefore we lived in a society of social descent, in which we were bootstrap population. So every generation, those that were at the bottom of society, those that were the very low intelligent people, would die out, would not pass on their genes. And those at the top would move downwards to fill the spaces that had been vacated by those that had died below them. And those at the top of the very top of society would, of course, get more intelligent, because intelligence was going up. So what this meant was that across the European medieval period and early modern period, the sons of the nobility would become the gentry, the younger sons of the gentry would become yeoman farmers, i.e. rich farmers. The sons of yeomen would become husbandmen, i.e. farmers that would take to the plough themselves. The sons of husbandmen would become labourers. The sons of labourers would become vagrants and would die. So that was the system. It was bootstrapping the population, and IQ was going up every generation. This is demonstrated across time. We have ancient genomes which demonstrate that the presence of alleles, of forms of genes, in our populations was increasing across time. No, at the genetic level, we were getting more intelligent. Now, between the year 1100 and the 1870s, the correlates of intelligence consistent with this are going up. There is not much change in lifestyle. The average standard of living in 1200 is not that different from the average standard in 1500 or indeed 1800. It's in 1800 that things radically start to change with the Industrial Revolution. And what you see across time is there are fewer murders. Murder and criminality in general is a sign of low IQ. There is increasing literacy, there is increasing numeracy, there is more per capita major innovations. So major innovations, big breakthroughs, and you can calculate these, how many there are per year, per million of population. And these are going up, 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 up. From 1100, when we start to come out of the Dark Ages, up until 1800. More major innovations. Head size is growing, so we can look at representative samples of skeletons from different periods of British history. If the size of the head is growing, on average, which is consistent, of course, with the size of the brain growing, and it's getting more intelligent. Also, interest rates are falling. One of the things that intelligence is associated with is time preference. People that think of the future, they are more intelligent. People that have what you call a low time preference. So they require less of a payback in the future to do something now. Whereas people that are low in intelligence, you say to them, okay, would you like to have 1 chocolate bar now or 10 chocolate, a child, let's say, 1 chocolate bar now or 2 chocolate bars in an hour's time. They'll have the 1 chocolate bar now. They can't wait the hour. They live in the now. The intelligent child will always choose 2 chocolate bars in an hour's time. So this is what's happening across time. So this is very clearly indicating that we are becoming more intelligent. Now, here is an indication. This is homicides per 100,000 of population in European countries between the 14th and the 20th centuries. And remember that there is not much different. Standards of living for the average person do not really start up until about here. So, but you see this collapse in homicide, and this would be consistent with people becoming more intelligent. One of the things we were doing, by the way, in a lot of European countries, we were literally executing about 2% of the male population every generation between 1100 and about 18. Almost all crimes that were serious carried the death penalty. Who would have been committing crimes? It would have been people who had low intelligence. And so by having execution for felonies in Britain, you were executing people of low intelligence, which would also have been raising IQ. But in general, there was this selection due to the survival of the richest, as I said. This is literacy in England. So again, you can see here's 1580. This is the percentage of the population that can sign their names in documents. You can see it's 20%. And it goes up and up and up. And here we are. By 1900, it's almost 100%. And so this is increasing across time, literacy, and this would be consistent with people becoming more intelligent. And you can see it as well to a lesser extent. Now, so why were we selecting for intelligence? Well, as I said earlier, rich people could produce healthier environments for their children. Intelligence is also genetically associated with having a good immune system. Intelligence seems to be genetically associated with health. So that's interesting. It implies when things are selected for under evolution, then they tend to end up being related to each other in evolutionary terms. But this is why height and intelligence have become related in men. Women are selecting for height and intelligence, so the two become bunched together. They become typically related. Now, you're getting the same thing, it seems, with intelligence and health. We're selecting for health, we're selecting for intelligence, and so the two things come together. So rich people are producing better environments. They also seem to be genetically more healthy. Until really about the 1700s, it was perfectly socially acceptable for rich men to have mistresses. So there was de facto polygamy in a lot of European countries. If you think about Lucretia Borgia, she was the illegitimate daughter of a pope. And there are many other examples in the medieval era of very, very prominent, important people having illegitimate children. Kings tended to have numerous illegitimate children, and there's Thomas Cromwell, who, if you've heard of Wolf Hall, it's this TV series based on a book about Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell had illegitimate children. Henry VIII, of course, had illegitimate children. All of these famous people were very wealthy men in this period, and it was very, very acceptable. So that helps to increase intelligence as well. As I said, all felonies carry the death penalty. Young, low IQ men, therefore, would have been hanged, and those men would have been unable to pass on their genes, and so this would again have contributed to the raising in intelligence. Every generation, the very low intelligent, impulsive criminal men would have been hanged and would have been unable to pass on their genes, and that process continued right up until about the 18th century. Another issue which is very important is it started to become very cold. You may be familiar with the medieval warm period. It was very warm in medieval Europe. It was much warmer even than now. This is reflected in England. I mean, in parts of England, even up to as far north as York, I think, you have towns where you have streets with names like Vine Street, Vineyard Street in London. This implies we were growing grapes in medieval England. Now, we can't farm grapes now in England, really, perhaps in some parts of Cornwall in the far south, but otherwise it's not really done. It's not warm enough. Why do you think Greenland is called Greenland? Because when Greenland was discovered in the medieval era, Greenland was green. It was a lush green place where you could farm. But it became a lot colder, decreased sunspot activity, that kind of thing. If it becomes colder, there is increased selection for intelligence. What you also get is something called group selection. So there are a number of ways you can pass on your genes. You can pass on your genes individually by having children. That's the most obvious way, of course. But what about the spinster auntie? The spinster auntie who had on say, and he was killed in World War I, and she never got over it, and so she never got married. And then she spoils her nieces and nephews bloody rotten. She's passing on her genes indirectly. She's engaged, she's helping the offspring of her relatives. This is called kin selection. Now, you can take this further to the level of the ethnic group. What the ethnic group is basically an extended kinship group, and we've got good data on this. The average Polish person will be more genetically similar to the next average Polish person than he will be to an average English person. Now, you're going to get all kinds of variation, but that's the way it works. And so what this means is that the Poles can be considered a genetic cluster, and in certain circumstances, it is in the interests of Polish people to act at the group level, an example of which would be laying down your life for your country in a time of war, that sort of thing. So what you get as it becomes colder and you can no longer sustain the population that you have is you get increased group selection. Now, what does group selection do? How do you win the battle of selection? There are two ways to win the battle of group selection. The first way is by being highly ethnocentric, very, very internally cooperative and externally hostile. Computer models indicate that those kinds of groups win the battle of group selection. They fight other groups, they win against other groups. The other issue is intelligence. If you're more intelligent than another group, if you can make better weapons than them, if you're more planful, strategically, militarily, if you're just cleverer than them, basically, and make better decisions, then all else being equal, you will dominate them, you will win against them. Now, how can you become more intelligent? How can you make these better weapons? Well, what you get is the concept of genius. Geniuses are the people that make better weapons. Geniuses can be regarded as group selected. What geniuses are people with very high IQ, outlier high IQ, extremely high IQ. And they combine this with a moderately antisocial personality. We have the big 5 personality traits that we measure: ocean, openness, conscientiousness, aversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness to new things; conscientiousness, rule following, working hard, that kind of thing; extroversion, feeling positive, feeling strongly; agreeableness is altruism and empathy; and neuroticism is mental instability. Those are the key 5 personality traits. Geniuses combine outlier high IQ with being moderately low in conscientiousness, rule following, and moderately low in agreeableness, so they're not very nice people. Now, what this means is they're extremely clever, so they can come up with original ideas. Low in rule following, they can think outside the box. They don't care about the rules. They don't care about obeying the rules. They can think outside the box, which means they can be original. And new ideas always offend people. They always offend vested interests. But if you're a genius, you either don't care about that, or you're too autistic to understand you'd offend people even if you wanted to. And so the consequence of that is that you come up with brilliant ideas, and these are the kind of people that come up with brilliant ideas. The James Watson, the person that discovered DNA, of course, he's dismissed now as racism. But as far as he's concerned, it's just the truth, it's the truth. I don't care, it's the truth, it's the truth. How can you object to the truth? So this is the genius. Now, so therefore there's selection for groups that have more geniuses, and therefore this pushes up intelligence. More intelligent society produces more geniuses. You know, the more intelligent your parents are, the more likely their outlier will be a genius. And so we become more intelligent. The Black Death in the 1340s can be regarded as a selection event. About 1/3 to 40% of the European population were killed. But among the serfs, i.e. the lowest social class, the people that would have had the lowest intelligence, 80% of them were killed. So this would have had, in England anyway, so this would have had massive consequences. This would have elevated the intelligence of the population substantially. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that the Renaissance happened, which was a kind of an intellectual movement, happened within a few generations of the Black Death. So we're also perhaps selecting for religiousness as well. Religiousness correlates with agreeableness, which we would have been selecting for, because more cooperative people are also more likely to wealth, agreeableness, and conscientiousness predict doing well. They predict wealth. So we would have been selecting for that kind of personality, and that's associated with religiousness. And one of the things that we did and religiousness also promotes group selection. How ethnocentric you are correlates with how religious you are. People who are ethnocentric tend to be more religious, and also they're more fertile. Religiousness predicts having more children. The two people in the world now that are breeding, as we will see in a minute, are stupid people and religious people. So these things are all being selected for. And we have inherited, by the way, a taboo on contraception as Christians, which is interesting, and we'll see why in a minute. Now, then we get the Industrial Revolution. Now, until the Industrial Revolution, of course, there was this system whereby if you'd have a large population, then there'd be too many people, then there'd be a famine or something, and lots of people would die, and then the process would carry on and start all over again. This was known as the Malthusian cycle. The Industrial Revolution broke this cycle because it meant that for the first time, production could outpace population growth, which meant that the population could grow and grow, and we could become extremely rich. Now, what this meant was that standards of living rose, and they rose enormously, and they rose very quickly. It brought us medical advances, including inoculations, including better hospitals, better medicine, and so on. And what this meant was that the child mortality rate in 1800 was 50%. 50% of children that were born died. And 90% of people that were born didn't have children. So only 10% of the population passed on their genes. At the moment, the child mortality rate in Western countries is 1%. So what this is that almost everybody under pre-industrial conditions was dying, and only the best, only the healthiest, and only therefore the most intelligent, because intelligence would predict essentially being able to be healthy, would survive. The second thing that happened, as well as the Industrial Revolution occurring, was that the climate became warmer. The climate has become, there was a Maunder minimum, very cold time that was reached in the late 1600s, early 1700s, where there were massive famines, for example, in Finland in 1698. 1/3 of the population died of famine because it was too cold. Now, the climate becomes warmer. This reduces ecological hardship. It reduces group selection pressure. It reduces war. And it means that there is less selection for groups with geniuses. So this starts to push, and remember, it's geniuses that have come up with these amazing ideas that caused the Industrial Revolution, right? The spinning jenny and whatever, all of these important ideas, that you've got the electricity, whatever. It's the geniuses who are the manifestation, highly intelligent societies who have come up with this stuff. So that's the first thing. Child mortality is heavily, heavily reduced. We then, and so therefore all of these people who would have been of the lower social classes, who would have had low intelligence, who would therefore have died, are living and passing on their genes and having children. So you'd expect this to cause the intelligence of society, mindful of the fact that the heritability of intelligence is 0.8, you'd expect it to cause intelligence to go down, even if nothing else happened. But other things did happen. We developed contraception. And contraception was taken up first by more intelligent people because they could read and they read about it in newspapers and they had the forward thinking to use it. An intelligent person will plan for the future and think, okay, I better use contraception. I don't want to have an unwanted child. A less intelligent person will be totally impulsive and just have sex. Now I want sex, I'm horny, I want sex. And so consequently, people who were more intelligent used contraception. The result of this was that by 1900, there was no longer a positive association between intelligence, to the extent that we could measure it by proxies, and IQ. The association was nil. Then other things happened. Then we start to develop a negative fertility IQ nexus. By the 1920s, there is a negative correlation between fertility and IQ. At the point of writing, it is minus 0.1 in most industrialized countries and also in many developing countries. There is a negative association. This is stronger among women than men. Among men, it's just under minus 0.1. Among women, it's minus 0.2. And it comes out overall as minus 0.1. Now, what's happening? Well, first of all, you have the collapse of religion. Due to better living standards, religiousness is associated with stress. The environmental factor that makes you religious is stress. If people are stressed, particularly mortality salience, if they fear they're going to die or their family are going to die, then they become more religious. So we start to become less religious partly because we are less and less and less stressed. Religiousness also means people want bigger families because God tells them to have them, go forth and multiply, all this kind of thing. But if they're not religious, they don't want them anymore. They don't want to have big families. Better living conditions, so you have more reliable contraception. This means that people that don't want to have children can avoid them. And so you end up with a situation where large families are associated with low IQ. People who have low IQ have large families. They don't want large families, but they're too impulsive to use contraception, so they have large families. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing is feminism. You may have noted, gentlemen in this room, that the girls with whom you were at school that weren't very intelligent may well have started having children when they were 16 with a series of unsuitable men. And by the time they are 40, they are grandmothers. So it's not just that they have more children, they have more generations. Whereas what intelligent women tend to do, increasingly, is dedicate all of their 20s, and increasingly even the first half of their 30s, to having children. To their careers. To their careers and their university and whatever. And then when they want to have children, they have maybe one or two. Maybe they find they left it too late. And indeed, the most intelligent women seem to not want to have children at all. Really intelligent women, all else being equal, don't have children. So this is obviously going to reduce intelligence. Then you get a situation where, of course, one of the things we know from evolutionary psychology is that men sexually select for youth and beauty. Why? Because in prehistory, a man has nothing to lose from the sexual encounter at all. And so he therefore can select, what he wants is the woman to pass on his genes. He wants youth, health, basically. He wants health. And beauty is a proxy for health. Low mutational load in the face, pretty face. Health. So he wants a healthy woman who's young, and that's who he goes for. The woman, of course, does have something to lose. She can get pregnant, she can be effectively disabled for a few months, and she's more likely to survive, and her child is more likely to survive if the father will stick around and will provide for them. So women are more picky, and what they tend to sexually select for is status. And they like looks, of course, as well, but they sexually select, more so than men, for status, for wealth, for socioeconomic status. They tend to marry hypergamously. In general, females will marry men who are from a higher socioeconomic background than them, and who earn more money than them, and who are more educated than men. If men and women are equally educated, then you get a situation where highly educated, intelligent women have no men who are higher up than them. So there's no one to choose from. There's just all these losers. So they don't breed. So this is yet another issue that's reducing IQ. And the third one is welfare and the acceptability of illegitimacy. There used to be very strong disincentives for people of low IQ, people who couldn't work, people who very low IQ, people with too IQ to have a job, to have children. They'd end up in the workhouse. They'd end up on the streets. They'd end up dead if they had too many children. With the welfare society, those disincentives are taken away. And we are now in a situation in Britain where if you divide the country up between those where families where both parents are working, i.e. average IQ or above, parents where one parent is working and one's on welfare, i.e. 90 IQ, a bit below average, and those where both parents are on welfare, i.e. an IQ of 80, only the families where both parents are on welfare are breeding at above replacement fertility. So this means that the future of England, and by extension other countries that have welfare, is people with very low IQ, because that's who is breeding. And finally is immigration. The average IQ, and this would be something that would get me in trouble in the West, but it's objectively true. The average IQ of Danish people we can set at 100. The average IQ of immigrants who live in Denmark is 85. so 15 points below the average. Obviously, that is going to reduce the IQ of the country and therefore reduce the ability of Denmark to sustain civilization. But there is a further effect of this. It reduces native IQ, because remember, there are two components to IQ. There is the genetic component and there is the environmental component. The environmental component is based around having an intellectually stimulating environment. You will be pushed to your phenotypic maximum IQ if you spend your time associating with very clever people. That will push and read, stimulating your mind. If you spend your time associating with people who are stupid, your IQ will not reach its phenotypic maximum. It will be at its phenotypic minimum. Yes, sir. Okay, we'll have questions at the end. Okay, so this then, of course, means that the education system is undermined. The ability of the society to push people to their phenotypic maximum IQ is undermined, and the native IQ starts to go down. Now, we are becoming less intelligent. The evidence for this. So reaction times have lengthened between 1880 and the year 2000, consistent with the drop in IQ of 15 or 20 points. Color discrimination, this is the ability to distinguish between different subtle shades of color, is a correlative intelligence. Why? Because you're better able to solve problems if you can see subtleties, little subtleties of difference. You're better able to solve a problem if you can perceive subtle differences and therefore make better decisions, more informed decisions accordingly. Color discrimination is getting worse. The use of high difficulty words, this can be used from Google Ngram, reached a peak in 1870. Now we are back where we were in 1700. So our ability to use words are thinking tools. The more precise and analytical the word is you can use, the better you can express yourself, the better you can think. And the more you can think, the more you will need these precise tools. Our use of these precise words is going down. Backward digit span, this is a correlative intelligence. The ability to count backwards is getting worse. Creativity, as measured by creativity tests, is declining. Spatial intelligence is declining. We are becoming more left-handed. Left-handedness correlates weakly with low IQ. It's a sign that something's gone wrong with the mind. If the mind is balanced between two hemispheres, you'll be normally right-handed. If the mind is skew, then you'll be left-handed. It means mutant genes in the brain making your brain go wrong so that you're left-handed. And we're becoming more left-handed, which correlates with lower IQ. Our faces are becoming less symmetrical, i.e. we're becoming uglier, physically uglier. Based on analyzing old skeletons and so on. That is consistent. As I said, being good-looking correlates with IQ. Per capita levels of genius, which I discussed earlier, so per capita levels of major innovations, really important innovations, are back where they were in 1600, from a peak in 1870. Based on current trends, by the end of the century, we in the West will have the same level of per capita innovation that we had in the year 1100, i.e. at the end of the Dark Age. And we know this is for genetic reasons because we have studies from Iceland which have shown that alleles that are associated with very high IQ have declined in the Icelandic population, the native Icelandic population, over the last 3 generations. Now, here is the per capita rates of significant innovations between 1450 and 2004. You see they go up. They reach a peak here about 1870, and they start to decline. And you can see that they decline very, very dramatically. Here is the use of usage frequency of very hard words between the year 1600 and 2005. You can see that we've got back to about the level that we were at in 1700. Here is the use of, this is the presence of these genes in Iceland that are associated with very high IQ. So what about the Flynn effect? You may have read in the newspapers that we are in fact becoming more intelligent, that IQ scores are going up. This is called the Flynn effect, and I must stress there's a difference between IQ and general intelligence. The IQ test measures intelligence, of course, but it doesn't measure general intelligence. It's an instrument that tries to measure intelligence, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect at doing it. The Flynn effect is a process whereby between about 1930 and 1990, IQ scores appeared to increase in Western countries by 2.5 points per decade. These increases, however, were on the remember we talked about G earlier. G is the fundamental of intelligence, the essence of intelligence. Whereas you've got these things that are weakly associated with intelligence, which they do measure intelligence, but only like a little bit. You can be very good at them and not be very intelligent. There's a weak relationship between these things, like driving a car, let's say, and intelligence. Right. Now, these increases between the 30s and 90s were on the least G-loaded parts of the test. On the G-loaded parts of the test, i.e. the parts of the test that really do measure the core genetic intelligence, we were getting worse. So concomitantly, on one thing, the environmentally sensitive stuff, we were going up, and on the genetic stuff, we were going down. This is called the co-occurrence model. Now, what was happening, according to my colleague that I wrote at our wit's end with my book, Michael Woodley of Manille, industrial society makes us think in a more analytic way. And this pushes to its phenotypic limit so-called analytic thinking, which is weakly G-loaded. So we reach our phenotypic limit. And once this is reached, then the underlying decline in G will show up, even on the IQ tests. So what was happening was we were going down slowly in genetic intelligence, but we were going up so quickly in these abilities that correlate with G, and which are tapped into by the IQ test, so quickly that it was coming across as an increase in IQ. Even though it's going down. But what it was driven by was by us doing fantastically well in these aspects of the IQ test that only weakly measure intelligence. But because of the imperfect nature of the IQ test and how well we were doing in them, we reached our absolute maximum. In a minute. This is exactly what has happened. And since about 1997, IQ scores have been going down in Western countries. And indeed, I've got data on this, in Estonia, they've been going down as well. So we reached a peak in 1997, and that was when we reached our phenotypic maximum for these things, and then since then, it's been going down, even on IQ tests. Now, this brings me finally to the rise and fall of civilization, which is that past civilizations have always risen and fallen. And what's happened is that a cold climate will select for intelligence, the civilization will grow and expand, and it will become warmer. With Greece and Rome and others, we can track this across time in terms of per capita innovation and climate change. And what always happens is that the society grows, the civilization grows, it becomes a civilization, a proper civilization, and then those at the top of society stop being religious and stop wanting to have children. And this was noted in ancient Greece, about 300 BC, something like that, that the people at the top of society wouldn't have children. By the time of Augustus, so sort of 40 years BC, it was noted in Rome that the aristocrats, the most intelligent people, were not having children. It always happens in this way. Sometimes they use contraception, sometimes they just avoid having children. The society questions its traditions, everything, including aristocratic rule and religion, because it's no longer under intense pressure. It's no longer stressed. If you're stressed, you're more instinctive, and you're more in touch with your instinctual drives that were selected for, such as religiousness and obedience and all this kind of thing. And so, therefore, the level of religiousness goes down, the level of ethnocentrism goes down, the level of intelligence goes down, and the society becomes invaded by a more religious and ethnocentric society, and you get a new dark age. And then there is intense Darwinian selection, and the process begins all over again. And if we look at what Polybius said, he did 200 to 118 BC, he said, in our own time, the whole of Greece has been subject to a low birth rate and a general decrease of population, owing to which cities have become deserted, land has ceased to yield fruit, although there have neither been continuous wars or epidemics, for men have fallen into such a state of pretentiousness, avarice, that's greed, and indolence, laziness, that they did not wish to marry, or if they have married, to rear the children born to them, or at most, as a rule, have only one or two of them. Now, isn't that an interesting parallel to what is happening in Western countries today? If you think that the average Western family has about 1.9 children, and the average Somali family in the West has 5 children. So, here is the rate of innovation in the ancient world, and what you can see, look, as it goes up, it reaches a peak here, about, this is the time of the Minoans, starts to go down, and then reaches the Nadia here in about 1100, and then it catapults up, and that is the West. That is what we are currently in. This in more detail, look, you can see this is the per capita innovations per million of population in the ancient world. You can see, look, here's the height. This is Socrates, Plato, whatever, all of the great innovations of classical civilization are here. Then it starts to decline, and all the things I said to you, feminism and lack of religiousness and whatever, they all rise. It reaches a nadir here. There's a mini outbreak here, Christianity. Then it goes down. Then you look, see, we're nothing for 1,000 years, and then you start to get a very cold climate, greater selection, and things go up. Okay, what does this mean for the future? Finally, So it means IQ will continue to decline. And we won't be able to do things we once could do. We will go backwards. There will be a law of diminishing returns. The West will degenerate into war, into conflict, into stress. There will be greater mortality salience. We won't be able to cure diseases. People who are genetic sicknesses will die. We won't be able to do things we used to be able to do, like getting Concorde back into the air, which I showed you at the beginning, which happened because of a little stupid decision. Somebody putting a bit of jagged metal on the back of the Airbus in front of Concorde, a short-term, stupid decision, cheap decision, which fell off. Concorde drove over it. Concorde crashed. Now, you can say, oh, we don't get Concorde back in the air because it wasn't economical. But what about moon landing? Why haven't we been back to the moon since 1972? Could that be because we just can't? We're not intelligent enough to do it. Because look at the Challenger disaster in '86. Little mistakes, down things. Can't do things we used to be able to do. Anyway, once this happens, religiousness will increase. Darwinian selection will reassert itself. But in the meantime, what we would expect is that the light of civilization, the West, as the West degenerates into inter-ethnic conflict, will pass to the East, will pass to places like this, where to a greater extent, okay, you have limitations on free speech here, there's things you can't talk about, but you can talk about this, and we can't talk about this, intelligence. This is an extremely important thing, intelligence, and its consequences. We can't discuss this in our universities. We have to, like me, be independent researchers with patrons. We can't discuss it within the universities. So what we would expect is that the light of civilization will pass here. Perhaps the more intelligent Westerners will flee to Eastern Europe. I'm already seeing that in Warsaw yesterday. Various Western people that live here, and they like it because it's safe. It's safe. And you can know, obviously, why it's safe. And Eastern Europe, though, I'm seeing signs. The changes here over the last 20 years is going the same way. It will go the same way. And perhaps then the light of civilization will pass to China, Japan, or even India. But eventually, we've flown so high for various reasons, possibly because of Christianity. We became very religious. We selected greatly for religiousness under the Black Death, and thus we became so religious. Religiousness, by the way, is 0.4 genetic. We became so religious that we got past the Industrial Revolution before we started questioning religiousness and using contraception, rather than this happening before it, and thus never reaching an Industrial Revolution. And so Darwinian conditions will be reimposed, and intelligence will be selected for once again, and civilization will re-emerge from European refugia, and one of these may well be Poland. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we have 15 minutes for a question. Let me start. I have one question because I think there will be much harder to find intelligent partner, business partner, employee. And my question is how to judge or choose very fast who is more intelligent, or because we don't have a lot of time on interviews for a job, so maybe it's some correlates.
There are various markers that simply from looking at somebody or listening to somebody would permit you to assess their intelligence. Talking speed correlates with intelligence. The use of high-order words correlates with intelligence. Symmetry of the face correlates with intelligence. Height, particularly in males, correlates with intelligence. Having a long face rather than a wide face correlates with intelligence. Large eyes correlate with intelligence. These are all weak correlations, I should emphasize. A big nose rather than a small nose correlates with intelligence. Eyes which are too close together negatively correlates with intelligence. Blue eyes correlates with intelligence. Blonde hair correlates with intelligence. Now, if these things all manifest in being fat, negatively correlates with intelligence. Now, if these things all manifest in one person, then, of course, you can't just look at someone and say, oh, that person's got blonde hair, he must be Einstein. It doesn't work like that. You can't just look at someone else and say that person's got a biggish nose, he must be very, very clever. But if all of these things come together, then you have something that is a sound mark. But those correlations are weak. Talking speed is something that I would say with much more certainty is a good marker of how intelligent a person is going to be. Talking speed, how quickly they can think. And that correlates with how quickly they're going to talk.
So you've said that we've got like potential for intelligence. And from that, I assume that when I've got, for instance, in family, somebody who's very intelligent and I talk with him on a daily basis, I've got like, I would have higher, maybe not IQ, but like you said, intelligence in G.
Well, G is highly genetic. For the environmental element, let's talk about IQ.
Okay, so I would have higher IQ if I had. Okay, so basically we can like there's a way to have higher IQ through.
A clever person who's born in the countryside, intelligence predicts migration, right? A clever person who's born in the countryside and stays there will probably not reach their phenotypic maximum IQ. If they migrate to the cities, which a lot of them do, and meet other clever people who live in the cities, it will push them to their phenotypic maximum. So yeah, who you talk to and who you associate will affect whether you're pushed to your maximum or not.
You've told us that we're on a highway to hell. How much time can you give us? And yes.
Well, I said to you that based on current estimates, we will be back 100 years hence to the level of per capita innovation that there was in 1100. Now, obviously, it won't be as bad as it was in 1100 because we will have maintained. We can think about our achievements in the Industrial Revolution as a bit like capital. So a very clever person makes an invention and they become rich. They then pass on the money to their stupid son. That son doesn't do many brilliant innovations himself. He just does minor tinkering, just little things which keep the money attaining interest and things getting better. And that's what we're doing. But eventually, as we become less intelligent, we won't be able to do even those minor things that keep the money growing. And then we start eating into the capital. And then once we eat into the capital, we can't do things we used to be able to do. We go backwards. So we will have gone backwards by 1100 for sure. Perhaps the standard of living here in the West will be like it is now in South America. Indeed, the predictions indicate the IQ 100 years hence will be about 86 in the West, so about that of South America. So think of South America. Your grandchildren will live in South America, in Poland.
Thank you very much for this informative lecture. I have a question about you. How do you work on mitigating this problem? Namely, how many children do you have?
I have two that I know of, but it could be more. But perhaps I'm operating at the group level. Perhaps I'm inspiring all of you, particularly the ladies who are clever, to have babies.
The one is standing in front of you.
Well done.
6 million of Poles died in the Second World War. Did you find correlations between IQ and a lot of that in the wars in Europe?
Yes.
In the last century.
There is some evidence for that, yes. So in the First World War, for example, the intelligence of the officers, the officer class, is normally about 15 points higher than that of the troops. 8% of the troops were killed. It was 16 in England and Germany, and it was 16% of the officers. So it seems likely that would have had a negative effect on IQ. In World War II, the average IQ of the British Army in 1939 was higher than it was in 1945. So what's happening is more intelligent people are more likely to be officers and thus get killed, but also more intelligent people are braver, they're more gallant, they're more likely to be altruistic and make sacrifices for others and get killed. So it is probable that it will have reduced IQ. Certainly I can tell you communism reduced IQ. And my colleague Michael Woodley of Mani has data on that. Communism appears to have reduced IQ by something like 5 points, mainly due to environmental fact, not reaching your maximum phenotypic intelligence, but also genetic IQ, because in countries like this and other countries, the cleverest people would tend to fight for the society and get killed. The average IQ in Poland is about 2 points lower than Britain, and that's within the margin of error. But were it lower, then it seems likely that the war would have played a part.
First of all, I would like to mention that I can relate very much to your opinion about the freedom of speech. Me living on a daily basis in Sweden.
It's you poor bugger.
Similar thing that I know, but I would like to gladly take your opinion about something that can be a game changer in intelligence topic, which is artificial intelligence. And what's your view on about that?
Somebody earlier I was talking to about this Harari guy. This was I don't think that's going to work, because we are falling in IQ, and we are falling in IQ very quickly. And so yes, you can create robots, but then you have to be able to create people that can sustain those robots and people that can fix those robots. And what happens if IQ goes down is every generation, the people at the top go. So the inventor class go. The people that can invent the thing go. Then the people that can fix the thing. Then the people that can maintain the thing. Then the people that can use the thing. And that's so eventually you're going to get people that can't operate cars. And that's the kind of process that's going on when IQ is in decline. We live in an over-promoted society where we're trying to do things we can't do, then things go wrong. So I'm not confident in artificial intelligence to solve problems, no.
What suggestions would we have for individuals trying to survive in a declining intelligence environment? So for example, let's say, I'm an inventor. I mean, that's hypothetical, right? But I invent something. But like, people don't find it useful, right? They don't even understand it. So, I could give more examples, but this is my question, sort of what we can do as individuals to improve our lives in that environment.
Very difficult question, this. I think one thing that's highly important, I'm afraid, is religion. If you think about the nature of religion and the way that geniuses operated, they operated at these universities which were founded on religion, and the idea was that your purpose as an academic was to understand God's revelation. And therefore, to lie, to say, oh, well, this is the truth, but I won't tell you the truth because it'll upset people, that was kind of blasphemous. And that focus on the truth maintained in universities still in the West until quite recently. And now they've been taken over by these postmodern ideas that there's no such thing as truth and whatever. So you've got all of the bad things about religion, i.e. the fanaticism and whatever, but none of the good things, such as there's an objective truth and there's a God that verifies the truth. So it strikes me that we have to nurture these geniuses, these types of people. They take like the Sheldon Cooper types. They tend to be very, very clever, but utterly socially incompetent, because the more intelligent you are, the weaker is the connection between the different subsections of intelligence. So if you've got very high G, then you might be brilliant at maths, but absolutely awful at you can't drive a car, you can't tie your shoelaces, you get lost in streets, you no social skill. So this is, we need to nurture these geniuses. At the environmental level, that's very important, nurturing geniuses. India is a society that's chaotic, but it nurtures geniuses. And this is very important. Nurturing these very clever outliers, I think, is something we could try and do.
I think you raised an important point, saying that there are different kinds of intelligence, and apart from this general intelligence, apart from IQ, we know that there is also emotional intelligence,
yes,
and also those who read Kiyosaki know that there is financial intelligence and possibly
all I can say to that is, first of all, emotional intelligence correlates with IQ at 0.3. So it's ultimately underpinned by general intelligence. It is a measure of general intelligence. People that are more intelligent, more emotionally intelligent. Financial intelligence is probably a combination of IQ and certain genius type traits, risk-taking and this sort of thing. It is the general intelligence that I showed you that has all of these correlations which predict doing well. I think that there's personality. That's important as well. People that have very high IQ and don't have this genius personality, just have very high IQ, spend their time playing chess and card games and things. They don't do much. The genius has to have the personality as well.
You said before that more intelligent women, they don't want to start a family, they don't want to have a kids.
Unless they're religious. No, they don't, no.
You said that more intelligent women, they don't want to start a family, don't want to have a kids?
That is correct, unless they're religious. You understand? The religiousness predicts it as well.
I have another question, because I like what you said about these scientists working on religious stuff. I read a biography of Leonardo da Vinci recently, and probably he was the most intelligent person in our recent history. And because he was, if not everyone knows, he was born as illegitimate child in the aristocracy. His family were notaries for like 4 generations, and because he was illegitimate child, he was not admitted to school. And in schools, they were forced to study religious dogmas for 2 years before they were even, allowed to study math and other sciences. And that's what really gave him, the advantage.
Yes, you may be right about that. In a society where schooling is really bad, perhaps the schooling is because it's just learning things parrot fashion. Perhaps it's a disadvantage. Yeah, you may be right. But I also add that Leonardo da Vinci, illegitimate child. What does that imply? Of aristocracy, high intelligence, and who has illegitimate child with low impulse control, low conscientiousness, low agreeableness. And so, what was he? Genius, high IQ, low conscientiousness, low agreeableness. I didn't know that, but that's very, very interesting, and that fits. Thank you.
Here, hi.
Hello.
What can I do on a daily basis as a person to minimize this process of decreasing of my IQ?
Decreasing of your, you mean, well, you're aging, and
yes.
What you are, how old are you, if you don't mind me asking? How old are you?
Sorry?
How old are you?
I'm 23.
You're 23, so you're nowhere near your intelligence peak. So what's going to happen is you will get more and more intelligent until you reach about my age, about 40, 38, 39, and then you will start to get stupider. There's not really much you can do about it. It's just life. You can stimulate yourself to your intellect maximum by reading and learning things.
Hello.
Hello.
I think today state of censorship, like that you that you experience on your university.
Just ask in Polish and he'll...
How to describe process of... how the censorship in Finland or UK start?
How did it start?
Yeah, how it started and
Well,
why and...
Yes, very possibly, yes. That religion tends to have dogmas, and religion is weakly negatively associated with intelligence, and so those dogmas are not to be questioned. And then as a society becomes less intelligent, then you would, all else being equal, then you would indeed expect it to become more religious. The only thing is that with the breakdown of selection, we're no longer selecting for religiousness. It's not these people who are highly religious people. They have high fertility. These fundamentalist Christians, they have high fertility, but they're not the ones that are causing the censorship. It's these left-wing people, these politically correct people, these multiculturalists. As far as I can see, what's happening is this. With the breakdown of Darwinian selection, child mortality breaks down, you get this build-up of mutations in the population, physical mutations. People would have died of childhood diseases, now they're living and passing on their genes. These correlate with mental mutations. So people who are sick physically are sick mentally. And they produce people that have maladaptive ideas for the group, which would have been selected out under Darwinian conditions because they would have correlated with poor physical health. Things like that you shouldn't have children, that life is pointless, animals are more important than humans, that we should negotiate. I was in an art gallery in Warsaw yesterday, and it said that we shouldn't just use mushrooms as our food, we should negotiate with mushrooms. What the bloody hell does that mean? Now, so you end up with what you would call spiteful mutants, people with maladaptive ideas. They rise to positions of power in the society because Darwinian selection broke down first among the upper classes. And the heritability of social class is about 0.7, it's very high. And then they influence even the non-carriers to do maladaptive things. They tell women that if you just are a wife and a good mother, you're a loser and you're pathetic and you're a waste of space. They tell men that if you do toxic masculinity, if you do the things you're evolved to do, you're sick and evil and a rapist. And they tell you to let in lots of foreigners into your country and destroy your own genetic interests. They tell all these things. Spiteful mutants. And once 25% of a population believe something, you get a tipping point where it starts to spread. And I think that is what has happened in Western countries since the 1960s.
Okay,
Uczelnia ASBIRO. Stworzona przez przedsiębiorców dla przedsiębiorców.